All right. Thank you everyone for joining today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Nada Sumik, and I am the National Field Manager for WeAreAllAmerica. And WeAreAllAmerica works to uphold and strengthen our nation's commitment to welcome and protect those seeking freedom, safety, and refuge in the United States. We organize people across religious and cultural differences to build inclusive communities where we all belong. Over the last few years, WeAreAllAmerica has held the emergence of an effective national organizing infrastructure that can mobilize public support for people fleeing violence and persecution, counter nativist forces, and develop more welcoming policies and practices in this area at the federal and state levels. Today's topic focuses around housing barriers and solutions. We will be discussing the current housing affordability crisis in the United States and the barrier and challenges newcomers face. Our speakers will also share the need to address these barriers, provide examples of innovative ideas happening, dive into potential policy solutions and ways we can expand housing to access for newcomers. They will also share best practices happening across the country. Now, before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items. Please be advised that this webinar session will be recorded and shared among our networks. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. We will be monitoring it. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and you may ask questions. And now to start off, I'd like to welcome my first guest, who will be sharing with us some of the housing barrier and challenges the refugee communities face. I'd like to introduce Lindsay Guerrero, the Director for Housing and Technical Assistance at Church World Service. And a little bit of background about Lindsay. Lindsay is leading the strategy, operations, and innovative housing and technology solutions across the U.S. to increase access to and affordable housing availability for refugees and newcomers. She is a humanitarian leader with 10 plus years of experience leading and designating programs across housing, disaster response, food stability, refugee resettlement, and immigration crisis. Lindsay has established and built strong partnerships with federal, state, and local governments, charitable foundations, business and technology, and delivering high ROI. Lindsay has also designed, created, and launched technology solution to the housing crisis in Silicon Valley alongside the city of San Jose and Google.org. She has extensive experience leading large, temporary, and permanent innovative housing solutions and emergency response multi-million-dollar programs, including California wildfires, floods, COVID relief, housing rental assistance, house sharing, and homelessness alleviation. As you can tell, Lindsay has amazing experience, and we're so glad to have you here, Lindsay. So I'll turn it over to you to give us a little bit more background on what is happening.
Yeah, good morning and good afternoon for all of you across the country. So thank you for the intro. As I mentioned, my name is Lindsay Guerrero, and I'm with Church World Service, overseeing our housing technical assistance project and various housing initiatives. And I'll go into that information in a bit about some of the work that we are doing at Church World Service. But I'm happy to kind of start off with, some of the housing affordability crisis and the background that we're currently seeing in the U.S. So for folks that are on this call, this likely is not new information to you. You're very aware that there's a housing crisis, and it's not only impacting the refugee and Afghan newcomer communities, but it is impacting folks across all areas throughout the nation. But we also know that those more vulnerable populations are impacted heavily. So what I'd like to kind of start us off with is just a framework of the housing crisis. And our policy and advocacy team at Church World Service created an amazing document that's probably circulated out through your community in some capacity. And it's a working document in collaboration with several different folks, some of which at IRC, but really just starting to address what are these challenges. And so I'm going to give kind of a brief synopsis of what those are, and then we'll kind of move into what we're seeing on the ground in resettlement, as Church World Service is one of the 9 national refugee resettlement agencies who then has affiliates throughout the country. So we know that safe, stable, and healthy, affordable housing truly does build stronger communities. However, the U.S. is facing a housing affordability crisis, and at present, we have excessive rent burdens. Ultimate consequences of these burdens are financial hardships, evictions, and even homelessness are daily realities for tens of millions of households, both U.S. citizens and new Americans alike. So what we're doing within the refugee community is we know that there are folks who were not formally houseless, but are becoming houseless and experiencing homeless challenges. And so there's several reasons for this. According to a Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, prior to COVID-19, renters in the U.S. were facing a housing affordability crisis. Nearly 25% of renter households in the U.S. were spending more than 50% of their incomes on rent each month, with little left over to cover other expenses. Prior to COVID-19, from 2012 to 2019, as the U.S. housing market recovered from the recession and grew, rents within the U.S. have continued to increase faster than general inflation. So we know that there's a lot of work to do, and this was happening pre the influx of African newcomers to the U.S. So that's a bit of the framework of the crisis, and then I can kind of share a bit about how these housing barriers and challenges are really impacting local resettlement agencies, also known as RAs, and newly arrived refugees. So would you like me to continue moving forward with those?
Yes, please.
Okay, perfect. So based on the framework, we know that this has been a crisis, and the research that our advocacy and policy team did, we know this is not a new crisis. That there's a lack of affordable housing nationwide. And when I use the term affordable housing, it's in general not necessarily affordable housing when it comes to federal funded programs such as HUD programs or Section 8 housing, those two, but I'm talking about just in general, the affordability of housing. There is a crisis nationwide. So we know it's incredibly complex. There's not necessarily one uniform strategy or approach, and it's impacting these vulnerable populations. So what we're seeing right now is common reports from resettlement agencies is lack of affordable housing, lack of available housing. Landlords, property managers, perhaps have never rented to newcomers, so there could be some resistance there just because they haven't done that previously. And then arranging temporary housing for large volumes of clients and large families. So ultimately, these challenges do directly impact local offices because it impacts their ability to increase capacity to resettle more. We know it's not easy, and it's truly a collaborative effort. So how do we see this playing out? I know a lot of folks are interested in the African newcomers and the influx of arrivals. So we know Afghans and refugees are especially vulnerable to these challenges of securing affordable housing because of the various rules and regulations in place for securing permanent housing, such as family size, permissible number of individuals per bedroom, availability of credit scores, the average background checks. These processes simply just do not make sense at times for newcomers who are some of the most vetted people to ever enter the U.S. Additionally, since these newcomers have just arrived and need immediate housing to get jobs, start school, etc., at times temporary housing has become the only option. However, I do want to highlight the temporary housing that a lot of the resettlement agencies are utilizing is indeed safe, sanitary, and meets the needs of the families. So what's next? I know we're going to go into some solutions. That's really framing the problem, but I don't want to just stop there. I'm really hopeful for solutions that are in motion right now. We know it is not a one solution kind of fits all, but it's going to truly be a collaborative effort. At CWS, we're continuing to work with our partners across all entities to advocate for more affordable housing, address policy concerns, and create innovative housing solutions. One of the projects that I'm overseeing right now is our Housing Technical Assistance Project, really to provide that technical support to all 9 national resettlement agencies and their affiliates to increase the availability and affordability of housing across the U.S. We believe this is possible to start creating change, and we're hopeful for that. And we know that if we can increase affordable housing, create innovative housing solutions, it not only benefits newcomers, but the entire United States. And I will pass it off to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for all that information and all of the hard work that you are doing with the Technical Assistance Initiative. I know that collectively we can get so much done around these barriers that, you know, families on the ground face. And now we're going to kind of start shifting the conversation to talk about housing solutions and best practices and you know, what we can do for folks on the ground and local communities. So I'd like to introduce my colleague Balkis, who is the Senior Policy Counsel at International Refugee Assistance Project and the Policy Advisor at the Refugee Advocacy Lab. She works on systemic advocacy to improve humanitarian immigration for refugees and other displaced persons, with a particular focus around refugee resettlement and support at the state and local level. In her previous role, she was a legislative attorney at the New York City Council and working on human rights and consumer protection laws, and the legal counsel at the Canadian Department of Justice. Balkis is an immigrant herself and the daughter of refugees who fled Libya in the early 80s. So Balkis, can you share with us how ARPA funding can be utilized for housing for local refugee communities? And can you share maybe 1 or 2 best practices or examples of other localities that have utilized it?
Thank you so much, Naira, for the intro and for having me here today. Just quickly, I prepared some slides to kind of explain what the American Rescue Plan Act is, and a brief overview before I delve into some of the housing details. But if folks want to get more information, the Refugee Advocacy Lab, which I'm a dual-hatted staff. I work at the Refugee Advocacy Lab and at IRAP, and we actually released a report that has a lot more details on how you can utilize the American Rescue Plan funds for advocacy for immigrants and refugees. So that's on our website, which is on the slide. If we can go to the first slide, please. So what is ARPA funding? Last year, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act, which allocated an aid package of $1.9 trillion. $350 billion of that was reserved for states and localities. So states and cities can spend this money to alleviate the negative impact of COVID, both the health impact and the economic impact, which is important to kind of take note of. These funds have to be obligated by December 2024, or they are sent back to the Treasury Department, the federal government. So what can states spend state and local fiscal recovery funds on? All they have to do is identify a negative health or economic impact of the pandemic, and then they have to design a program that is related and is a proportional response to that. So this is very relevant to what we're speaking about today. Next slide, please. So who is eligible? ARPA really emphasizes and encourages investments in communities hit hardest by the pandemic, which are namely underserved and underprivileged communities of color, including immigrants and refugees. So this is really important to emphasize, especially if you decide that you want to do advocacy at the state and local level. These are the communities that ARPA is meant for. And so, that funding is meant to come and serve those communities, and there should be a lot of advocacy to ensure those funds actually reach who they're meant for. The Treasury Department released a rule in early January, a final rule in early January that describes who is eligible. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to kind of, emphasize. Recently, resettled refugees are eligible for, programs that are funded by ARPA. So you don't actually have to prove that they're eligible. They're automatically presumed to be eligible. So this is really important if you're doing advocacy at the state and local level. If they ask you, well, the Afghan refugees just arrived here, like, are they entitled to this? They weren't here during for the most of the COVID pandemic. And yes, they are. They're presumed to be eligible. The other groups that are presumed to be eligible are impacted and disproportionately impacted households. And the rule kind of goes through which households these are, but anybody experiencing housing and food insecurity is presumed to be eligible. Low-income households, people who reside in qualified census tracts that are designated as low income are automatically presumed to be eligible. You don't have to prove that these groups are eligible. And that's really important at the state and local level, because if your elected official asks you, or you're the chair of your appropriations committee, you can just say, listen, you don't have to go through compliance or proving that these groups they're automatically presumed to be eligible. And the other thing that I'll point to, which isn't as relevant in the refugee context, but when you do this advocacy, we try to advocate for as many populations as we can. And it's important to note that ARPA, unlike other under like the CARES Act or other COVID funding, there's no specification for immigration and immigration status requirements. So undocumented individuals are eligible for assistance. Next slide, please. So sorry for the font being a little small, but I just want to kind of give folks an overview of what types of services can be funded through ARPA. I started off with some of the housing, like emergency housing assistance program to support long-term housing, home repair and home weatherization, and then cash assistance. There's a whole, it's very diverse. States and localities have a broad discretion to really apply the funds and find solutions that work at the state and local level that are responsive, to the unique impacts of the pandemic in their locality. So there really is a big laundry list of things that qualify, and housing is definitely one of them. Next slide, please. Specifically on housing, what type of programs are eligible? Initially, it wasn't clear whether capital expenditures on housing was allowed, like basically, allotting funding for the actual building of affordable housing. That was clarified in the final rule that was issued this past January, that yes, states and localities can allocate, capital expenditures towards actually developing affordable housing. So this is really important because it wasn't clear before that this could be done. And now a lot of states and localities are seizing on this opportunity, and they're actually developing affordable housing. And this is, really important because there is an actual shortage of actual housing. No matter, how many subsidies, states and localities issue, it'll never be enough to address the need, because actual housing, there's actually a housing shortage. And so this is really important. The other thing that's important to emphasize, besides rental assistance, is mortgage assistance. The American Rescue Plan Act supports helping and encouraging home ownership amongst impacted and disproportionately impacted communities. For disproportionately impacted households, states and localities can actually improve vacant and abandoned property. I think it was a suburb of Cleveland that actually used ARPA funds to demolish a bunch of abandoned housing, and they're planning on rebuilding affordable housing in their stead. So this is something that's also, important to emphasize. And I also wanted to make a point about emergency rental assistance. So the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act had large substantial sums for emergency rental assistance, which is referred, for CARES Act, it's ERA 1, for American Rescue Plan, it's ERA 2. ERA funds are mostly exhausted or have been reallocated. The deadline was last fall to obligate the funds. And so a lot of states left these funds unspent. Some states spent less than 16%, which is, unfortunate. And so the Biden administration pressured those states to reallocate those funds to counties and cities. And so it's worth checking with your local city and your county whether those funds have been replenished. And ERA2 funds are still available and don't have to be obligated, I believe, until either 2024 or 2026. Don't quote me, but there's quite some time to spend those funding. And there's also a lot of resources. So some states and localities require a residency requirement for ERA funds, like you had to have lived there for a certain amount of time. And it's really important for folks to point out to their, government agencies or local electeds that those have the potential of excluding, recently resettled refugees or the undocumented. And those aren't requirements that are in the Act. And so it's important to kind of emphasize that some of these programs are leaving out people that are in need and to ensure that that doesn't happen. And so I just want to kind of highlight that. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of housing initiatives in various states and localities. Nebraska is currently considering a proposal for $8 million for affordable housing for refugees. NARA is leading a great example in Phoenix for transitional housing, which is an extremely great model and very innovative and much needed. New Haven, Connecticut is also in the process of approving $10 million for affordable housing, and some of that is for refugees. Seattle, Washington has allocated $25 million in cash assistance, which can also be used for rental assistance. And Wayne County has allocated $20 million for housing for Afghan refugees, which is, quite a substantial amount. And these are just a small number of examples, and we're going to start to see more since a lot of states and localities are currently in the process of allocating funds. Some of them have obligated portions of their funding and not the entire thing. So there's still a lot of opportunity, depending where you are, to advocate for additional funding. Next slide, please. So I quickly put together a checklist of how do you go about, advocating for state and local fiscal recovery funds. It's important to first look up how much your state or locality has received, and it's important to look up both separately. The state has received its own funding and localities have received their own funding. And there's a formula of how to calculate this, but this is all available on Treasury's website. There's also a lot of NGOs that are also tracking these allocations. And so if you go to our website, refugeeadvocacylab.org, we have those resources, and you can look up how much your state or locality has received. And that's important in determining how much, you could ask for. A lot of states and localities are also collecting community feedback, and some of this feedback can be collected online. So it's a good idea to kind of mobilize your communities to advocate for some of that funding to be redirected to refugee housing. And it's also important to look at who else is working on this issue. This webinar is focused on refugee issues, but there are a lot of other organizations that are doing housing advocacy, and it's important to also reach out to them and kind of align asks or work alongside them where interests align. Stage 2, organize and mobilize. It's really important to work, as I mentioned, in a coalition or with other community organizations. As you meet with the chairs of budget committees, with your elected officials, with the mayor's office, the governor's office, it's really important to kind of have others in your group represented in a coalition. That's how you gain traction and you get the attention of the people that decide where this funding goes. Also grassroots activism is really important, educating and mobilizing individual community members to reach out to their elected officials and ask for, ARPA funds that are assisting refugees and immigrants in your communities. Meet with them. It's really important to kind of target not just the decision makers, but also the chairs of budget committees, and your local electeds can help you figure out if you have questions, or you want to figure out how to navigate the process, your local electeds or the chairs of budget committees can help you figure out where they are in the process and how you can go about advocating for those fundings. It's also important to not forget about housing agencies, state and local housing agencies. They also sometimes are given broad allocations of funding that they have flexibility then to spend it depending on where the need is. And finally, and this would happen later on in the advocacy, is to attend and give testimony at budget hearings. Even if it's, even if you get approval for your project, or it's going to be voted favorably, it's good to kind of attend, give testimony, support your local electeds, and thank them for allocating those amounts. And if you're successful, we'd love to hear about it. We're tracking, what different states and localities have done in terms of ARPA funding. And so we would love to hear from anyone on this call who's done anything, and we'd love to feature, those successes. And with that, I will pass it back to Neera. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Balkis. That was really, really helpful and informational. I know there was a question from Dr. Samia earlier. If they presume to be eligible, then where is the lapse in getting them the proper housing? I don't know if you want to address that real quick. It was a comment at the beginning of your section.
Sure. So what I meant by presumed to be eligible is that the federal government, when it allocated this amount, they issued a rule that contains criteria for what states and localities can spend it on. So that's just the rules. So for example, there's certain things that state localities can't spend on. For example, they can't start expanding prisons. They can't use ARPA funding for that. But things that are presumed to be eligible, so if anything isn't presumed to be eligible, the state and locality has to explain to the federal government why it's eligible. And so what I meant by saying presumed to be eligible is that the state and locality doesn't have to sit down and lay out why recently resettled refugees are eligible. They're already presumed. All they have to say is recently resettled refugees qualify for ARPA fundings, and we're trying to alleviate this negative impact, and that's it. You don't have to add more. And so just because they're presumed to qualify doesn't mean those services are already available. We have to advocate for them. As earlier I showed you that list of some 20 plus different things that states and localities can spend on. A lot of states aren't prioritizing refugee and immigrant communities, or they aren't prioritizing Black and Brown communities, African American communities. They're not doing that. And so it's really important for community members to rally together and advocate and make sure those funds are spent. Some states are sitting on the money. They're not spending it at all. That's a real problem. This funding it's your money. It's your community's money. You need to rally, you need to ask for it, you need to demand it, and you need to make sure those services are provided. That's your money. Go get it.
Thank you, Balkis. That's right. The money's out in the communities, and we need to advocate to ensure it gets into the communities that really need it, vulnerable populations such as the refugee and immigrant communities. So thank you, Balkis. And now we're going to turn it over to my colleague, Britt Conroy, who's going to talk a little bit about what the work that he's doing in Oregon. And just a little bit background on Britt. Britt serves as the Director of Public Policy and Environmental Advocacy for Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, where he leads the organization's advocacy efforts to make Oregon a more welcoming state to immigrants and refugees, to provide housing for the unhoused, to address climate change and strengthen anti-poverty programs, among other areas of focus. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science and Spanish from Oregon State University and a master's degree in forced migration from the University of Oxford. He is married, the father of 2 wonderful children, and lives in Portland. So Britt, can you share with us what you are doing in the state of Oregon to help newcomers with housing?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon and good morning. Thanks, Neera. Really glad to be here and really excited and proud to be a colleague with Lindsay and to get to partner with Balkis. Super appreciate Balkis. Is just huge amount of information there that we all can leverage. So yeah, good morning. My name is Brett Conroy here in Portland, rainy Portland, Oregon, this last day of February. And we've been working over the last number of months, a number of years on both short-term and long-term changes to provide more affordable housing to recently arrived refugees. In the short term, we're really fortunate to be able to have some wonderful legislative champions here in Oregon that were able to secure a significant investment for arriving Afghan evacuees. And that in the housing space, that looked like a $5 million investment in emergency housing shelter at hotels and motels as evacuees first arrived. And then also $6 million in rent assistance that will allow for hundreds of individuals to provide secure housing for up to the first year they're here, when you combine the state support with federal welcome dollars. And that's really exciting. We're hoping that we can shift a conversation in Oregon politically around how much housing support a recently arrived family deserves and needs to get on their feet, find work, become stable, and provide for the family. So we're hoping that these one-time allocations for the Afghan community can be a template for investments later on for all of our communities who are arriving and need to find affordable housing in, like all of your communities, in what is an increasingly expensive housing market. There's a couple other areas that I think are even more excited on long-term, in a long-term sense. First, what we've done we've worked hard to leverage the tragic Afghan crisis to raise awareness about how to better secure housing for arriving refugees. What typically happens here in Oregon is that we have just a few days, our resettlement agencies have just a few days to find decent, affordable, well-located housing when they learn that arrival is due. And what we've been able to do with some of our rent assistance dollars from the state of Oregon is actually create a revolving housing fund at our agency. So we have funds in advance where we can go and secure an apartment in advance of receiving a notice that a family is coming. And this helps us make sure that we have housing that's in the best possible location, in high opportunity zones, that is affordable, that's decent, that is connected to good schools, and is in a place that is going to be a supportive community. So really excited about how do we, again, at a very low cost, how do we we're using state dollars to seed this fund, and then that fund will be replenished as dollars come in the welcome money. The other thing that I think that's really needed that we're working on is a couple key positions. One is a housing coordinator at our state housing agency. So we know that historically what has happened is that our resettlement agencies have developed really, really strong relations with landlords. And before the housing crisis, landlords would basically set aside units for our resettlement agency colleagues, and with extreme demand and real lack of affordable housing, that is no longer the case. Our resettlement agency colleagues have been forced to engage with new landlords across, particularly the Portland metro region, as well as other communities here in Oregon, trying to convince landlords that despite the fact that recently arrived refugees have no job, have no credit score, and have other challenges, that they are deserving of and should be given a chance to rent an apartment. And that's just been really, really difficult here in Oregon. Clearly, there's concerns that racism also plays a role in this. And so a state housing coordinator is going to be able to engage with local landlords, engage with housing authorities, look for federal funding opportunities to try to increase and open up access to these housing opportunities for recently arrived refugees. And complementing that, we're establishing housing coordinators at our resettlement agencies themselves to leverage those resources and to look for development and grant opportunities that can that can open up pathways to housing. So I think that feels like, although it's one-time funding, feels like that could be a long-term structural shift that could help broaden access again to housing. The final thing that we're working on is something that speaks about Keith's point about the fact that at the end of the day, our housing struggles stem from a lack of housing supply. And at our organization, we run 8 direct service programs. Refugee resettlement is just one of the 8. We also run programs for young people experiencing homelessness and low-income Oregonians who are looking to find affordable housing. Also a program that supports those who are at risk of losing housing, who are homeowners. And leveraging our networks with advocates in the housing community, and the fact that we have about 700 congregations across the state that are looking to contribute to addressing homelessness. What we've done is starting to create programs that utilize the property that, I should say, take advantage of underutilized church property around the state. So often in our congregations that are tied to our direct service work, so often these congregations sometimes are shrinking, sometimes they're financially in jeopardy, and yet at the same time they're looking at how can they offer new ministries, new supports to their community. And underutilized land like a parking lot or a field that currently is untaxed and not in use is a way that many of our churches, members and otherwise, are thinking about how to not just sell that to the highest bidder in the private housing development sector, but rather partner with nonprofit developers and turn that piece of land into affordable housing for those experiencing homelessness, for recently arrived refugees, for those emerging from incarceration. And this has a tremendous amount of potential, we think, across the state. And it's something that's already achieved success here in Portland with the work of a couple really prominent and influential faith leaders. And so I think when we think about long-term, how in 5 years from now can we make sure that those Afghan evacuees who are in 2021 still have affordable housing in 2026? This is the kind of thing that we think is possible. Is again, take advantage of unutilized land, have some investment in partnership with technical agencies at the state and city level to offset costs, and get people through permitting processes. And we think this is something that has a lot of potential as developers continue to tell us that the #1 challenge for them when it comes to building affordable housing is identifying and funding purchase of land. So those are some of the areas in both responding to the Afghan crisis and shifting our agencies in a systemic manner and looking at long-term construction that we're working on here in Portland and in other communities in Oregon.
Thank you so much, Britt. That is amazing work you guys are doing in Oregon. I know there's still a lot more to be done, but that is really amazing what you all have been able to accomplish. Thank you so much. And I think now we're going to kind of shift our conversation a little bit to the importance of also housing education for newcomers, and how localities and local advocates can help educate newcomers on housing. So I'm going to turn it over to my good colleague, Ramzy, who's going to talk a little bit about that and why housing education to our newcomer Afghan communities is important. Now, just a little bit of background on Weiss. Weiss is our WeAreAllAmerica Afghan refugee housing and welcoming navigator. He resides in Arizona, and Weiss studied social work at Kabul University until he was forced to flee his war-torn homeland. He assisted Afghan refugees in accessing community resources when he lived in Austria. Since 2007, Mr. Ramzy has been well connected with the Afghan community in Arizona, where he helps new Afghan arrivals. Mr. Ramzy joined the WeAreAllAmerica team in late January, and we're really happy to have him. And in his current role, he works on connecting newly Afghan arrivals to key services such as housing, legal services, and support, and supports them in the path to self-sufficiency. So Weiss, can you tell us why is housing education to our newcomer Afghan communities important?
Thank you so much, Naira. Hello, and thank you for having me on this webinar. My name is Weiss Ramzy, and I am the we are welcome. We are all America welcoming and housing navigator in Arizona. I am originally from Afghanistan, and I have been in Arizona since 2007. I have been working with refugee as a volunteer for over 12 years, and recently working in supporting new arrival Afghans family. I have seen in challenge my community has gone through, especially the impact of the housing shortage in Arizona. Here we have received over 2,000 Afghans, and Arizona is facing many issues with the comes to housing. Aside from the housing shortage, today I want to talk about importance of housing education for my community. When refugees arrive, they are walking into a new culture and new way of life. Culture and laws in the United States is different from their native countries, and we need to provide education for newcomers on things such as cultural competency and housing in the United States. For example, in Afghanistan, we do not have rental agreement like the United States. In fact, most people have never lived in an apartment, whereas in the United States, many people live in apartment and have a basic understanding of lease agreement. In Afghanistan, the majority of people own their own land and home. They acquired the land family through generation. If they do rent, they rent a home, not an apartment, and have an informal verbal agreement with the landlord. But there are no formal lease agreement or such things, such as security deposit. This is a big change for Afghan people to understand when they arrive here. This is why providing housing education is so important when they arrive. It is important to provide them information on noise ordinance, role on the pets, prohibited livestock, and children being accompanied at all time in the areas such as pool, such as public pool. If Afghan people are not educated and don't receive orientation on the role of living in apartment or the U.S. housing system, it can have consequences for them, such as being kicked out, cops being called out, which can potentially affect their immigration status. When it comes to tools and information, there are a few things that come to mind. You can do outreach in a space where Afghan families are housed and set up a presentation to the Afghan community. Explain housing, education, and cultural competency. It is important to cover content such as lease agreement, what lease agreement are, what are security deposit, what happens if you don't pay your rent on time, tenant and right and landlord right and responsibility, and what it means to be a good neighbor. Also, many Afghans are very active and utilize social media platforms such as Facebook or WhatsApp and Viber. There are provide Afghan group on Facebook, and sharing information on this page is very effective and useful. The second item I would recommend in local communities is building small teams of Afghan volunteer leaders who can help educate new arrived Afghan on the role. This individual can also help connect them with services and resources in the United States. This can be local rent and utility assistance program, and connecting them to their resettlement agency and case workers. Lastly, I want to mention the importance of connecting and building relationship with newly arrived families, making them feel welcomed. When someone feel welcomed and accept, it is much easier for them to integrate into this new culture. So thank you for your time. I hope things was helpful, and turn it back to Naira. Thank you.